Welcome to the Bartow History Museum. My name is Trey Gaines. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the director here at the museum, and we're thrilled to have you out here this evening. So we'll get on to our main event this evening. Our program tonight, Justice Robert Benham and Sherry Henshaw with Bartow County are here to talk about the proposed African American History Trail, Heritage Trail through Bartow County. Sherry Henshaw is the coordinator for Keep Bartow Beautiful with Bartow County. She is a lifelong resident of Bartow County and is married to Joe, and we're glad to have you out here. She and I have been working a lot together lately on the Carver Park project, and so we are glad to have her here this evening with us. Robert Benham, who may not need an introduction to a lot of y'all, but I'll give it anyway because it's impressive. We're glad to have you here. Justice Robert Benham is a lifelong resident of Georgia. He graduated from Summerhill High School in Cartersville in 1963 and Tuskegee University with a BS in Political Science in 1967. He attended Harvard University and graduated from the University of Georgia Lumpkin School of Law in 1970 and the University of Virginia in 1989. Did you stop at that, or do you have more coming?
No, I ran out of money.
Ran out of money. After completing law school, Justice Benham served in the U.S. Army Reserve, attaining the rank of captain. He then served briefly as a trial attorney for Atlanta Legal Aid Society, later returning to Cartersville, where he engaged in the private sector of law, served as Special Assistant Attorney General, and served 2 terms as President of the Bartow County Bar Association. On April 3, 1984, Justice Benham was appointed to the Court of Appeals by Governor Joe Frank Harris. He won statewide election and served on the Court of Appeals for 5 years. In December of 1989, Justice Benham was appointed to the Supreme Court of Georgia by Governor Joe Frank Harris, and later won statewide election to a full term on the Supreme Court in July of 1990. He's married to Nell, who's here with us this evening as well. I'm glad to have you both here. And they have 2 sons, Corey and Austin. Please welcome Sherry Henshaw and Robert Benham.
Trey, I may let you do that. I just want to apologize in advance if I have to take a sip of something. Colin is about to do me in. But I work for Bartow County government in community development. And you heard Robert's introduction. When the commissioner tells you somebody's interested in a project and needs some help, then you sit up and you listen. So I've enjoyed listening to Robert's vision, and that's what we've tried to put together with this. We started with Bartow Carver Park, and it's progressed from there. So this is a presentation we put together on the proposed trail.
Helps if I turn it on.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it does help. That's why I let you do that part. So the concept was to create a heritage trail, and this came out of our discussions from Carver, where we were trying to work on that park, and then he just kept going. He just kept telling me all these things that he had in his head and what he'd like to see happen. And I was familiar with some of the sites and some I was not, so I started doing some more research in how I could help him and what we could do to make some connections. That's kind of a lot of what we do in community development, is just try to integrate different aspects of programs and help good things grow. So this would link Carver to the other historic sites in the county, and it would be of interest to tourists as well. And of course, economic development was one of the main things you mentioned. And then, so going to, I found this great publication. It's online, if any of you want to see it, 7 Steps to Plant a Heritage Trail. That's kind of what I based this part on. And it just was a naturally evolved on some of the sites that what we were doing, even unconsciously. So this gave me a guideline. Connecting a number of sites. Justice Benham has identified 10 sites so far, and he's going to speak on those in a moment. It encourages preservation because several of the sites are endangered or threatened, and we hope to, this brings more awareness to them and helps us to facilitate some preservation efforts. Of course, we've talked with tourism folks, printed guide to connect the sites and possible website links from one site to another, and then driving the trail. We've kind of laid them out from south to north or north to south. So. And then, of course, telling the compelling stories that are along the trail. Again, Justice Benham is great at doing that, but there are people at every site that are very good at telling the stories from their locations. And then we hope to uncover some more stories and include those and to help create a timeline. Major themes in Bartow's that have already come to the surface are the African American community, of course, the education for minorities with the 2 Rosenwald schools, African American history, roughly about 1830 to the present, African American business and industry. So I think those are great overriding themes that every site can link to. Then mapping your stops along the trail. There, of course, we hope that each stop we should be able to easily access it and identify it, and by going from north to south or south to north, more or less around the county, you should do that, easily be able to do that. And then these are some of the other amenities. Of course, all the sites won't have that, so this would give us some guidelines moving forward on how we could, on some key points to be looking at and what each site may need in addition. And decide how you'll tell the stories. Each stop, of course, will do that in their own way. We're adding interpretive signage right now with a grant, tourism grant for Bartow Carver. Well, it's no longer Bartow Carver, it's now George Washington Carver Park. Yeah. And Ellen Archer is working on that grant right now. She's using some of the information Trey and I've gotten to show out here. If you haven't seen the Carver exhibit, please do that before you leave. But that type of signage is already in place in New Harley. For instance, the downtown, that signage is very nice there. And that's what we hope to see at each site, is something that will tell that story. And then create a plan to develop and manage the trail. This, again, identifies local organizations, partners, groups that we can work with, and then site-specific partners. And then marketing, which is tourism, of course. We work a lot with them on that and develop all these different resources. Once the trail is developed, Georgia Tourism is very interested in that. Notice that last item down there. In the historic high country region of northwest Georgia, that quadrant, over 20% African American tourist traffic up I-75. So we think that's really important. We think that's a resource that we can capture. I think the last statistic, I wasn't able to get the last one from Ellen, maybe 2015 was 23%. It's actually higher than that. So that gives us a chance to capture those families and the individuals that travel north to south and might stop. They could stop at Adairsville and access it from there. There's a museum and a visitor center there if we can work on the site there. And then from Carver, going north, the same thing. So it gives us a chance to get people in and around and moving through Bartow County and to some of these other sites as well. So from there, these are the 10 sites, and I'm going to let Robert talk about these sites.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here and to share information with you concerning some of the historic sites in Bartow County. I'm comfortable talking about these because my family has been in Bartow County since 36. And my family was part of 60 slaves that were owned by Colonel Willis Benham and his brother, who were doctors here in the county. And they came from Lawrence, South Carolina. And I've been back to visit the plantation in Lawrence, South Carolina, too. But we have such a wonderful history here in Bartow County. I think it's important for us to share it with people from throughout the country. Of course, my family has been in business off and on for a number of years, and I always look at it from a business angle for Bartow County and what can it bring to us in terms of dollars. Some of you might not know, but we have at least 4 major highways coursing through Bartow County. So we have people coming through from north, east, south, and west. It's one of the few towns that have as many major highways as we have coming through, except Atlanta. But it is an economic opportunity for the city. And before I started talking about the various sites, and we're going to talk about them, let's just talk about the business for 1 minute or so. Now, where we are right now in the courthouse, this was the center of African American businesses in Cartersville. Now, there are none left now, but I do want to give you the names of all of those businesses that existed from the courthouse here, going away all the way up the street, coming down the other side of the street. Some of you are young enough to remember Happy and Sarah Younger, who had a cleaner. Well, that was the last business that existed here in this area. But before that, I think we had at least 10 African-American businesses that were on this street and on the one across the street. And I want to sort of give you some of the names so you know what some of them were. In fact, one of them I discovered was actually run by my granddad. And the reason I discovered that is because my mom ended up having her store in the same area where my granddad had his store back in the 1910s or 1920s. She never knew of that history, and very few people knew, but I would go and search the business records and things of that nature just to find out who was doing what, when, where, and how. But also in the same area, we had here 2 other restaurants, and we had 2 other tailoring shops, one of whom became my neighbor later on, Mr. Willie O'Neill, who lived right down the street from me, but I never knew he had a business in downtown Cartersville. And his wife was Hicksy O'Neill, who had gone to Spelman to gain her degree in nursing, and Willie O'Neill had gone to Tuskegee, where I later went to school, and obtained a degree in tailoring. So a lot of that history was lost over the years, and now we try to remind young people how meaningful that history was. And then there were 2 other restaurants that I mentioned earlier. The first African-American woman to run a funeral home, who died in 1953, Miss Maggie Knight, who my dad worked for her as an embalmer when I was a little child. And when he came home at night, he would bring me ice cream, but I wouldn't touch him. No. And my daddy thought I was just an ungrateful child, but I just, no, you've been doing that. I'm not going to touch ice cream cone you bring in here. But that kind of history is important to know in terms of who did what, when, where, and how. Now, rumor has it, but it has not been verified yet. How many of you ever ate a hamburger? Well, rumor has it that the hamburger started here in Cartersville. And the reason the rumor has it is because the fellow who ran a restaurant over there, and I knew him as a child, his name was Hamburger Bill. And he was the one that decided he'd start mixing beef and grinding beef and putting sausage in it, and that was supposed to have been, now that's folklore, I can't authenticate it one way or another, but I knew we always called him Mr. Hamburger Bill. And he used to attend my church, so I knew him as that as a young man in the church. So some of that history has some validity, some of it can't be traced one way or another. But I do want to express appreciation on behalf of my colleagues on the Supreme Court. The members of my court saw an article in the paper that we also get in Atlanta. Our public information person prints out articles that appear in papers all over the state. And a couple of my judges came to me and said, we thought you just worked for us. We didn't know you were working for Bartow County too, so. Because it had an article about this program taking place this evening. But I do want to thank Trey for all of the work he's done with this project, and Ms. Henshaw and all she's done for it. I mean, she's like an Energizer bunny. Whenever she calls me, I say, oh, gracious, what she got for me to do next? I mean, she just keeps going. But I want to thank the commissioners of the Bartow County who have been on this from day one in terms of how we could do this and how we could make these projects work. So let's start at the first one, and which is, which one are we going to do?
Go backwards, 10 to 9, 10 to 1.
Carver Park.
Carver.
All right, we'll start at Carver Park. Brother Atkinson, will you stand up and let people see you? It was his daddy that started the Carver Park. He lives in Atlanta. And I remember him as a young kid because he and his brothers would teach people how to swim, and they were the first lifeguards up at the park, and he and his brothers did the swimming. The mom did the cooking in the kitchen along with the lady from here in Cartersville, and a fellow that we could now call Hoss King helped in the construction of the Carver Park, George Washington Carver Park. His dad was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and it was his idea to start a park because there were no parks for African Americans in the state. And he contacted the state, and the state leased 345 acres for the establishment of the park. And the rest of it is history in terms of what that park did. But we have had roughly about 4 superintendents of the park. The first superintendent was Mr. John Atkinson, his father. The second superintendent was my dad, Clarence Benham. The third superintendent was, who was Mrs. Kitchen. Mr. Kitchens was the third, and then the fourth superintendent was Ricky Patton, who lives here in Cartersville from the Patton Funeral Home family. And then he was followed by Samuel Lee Nathan, and Samuel Lee Nathan had been the person who headed our ski team, and he taught all of us how to ski, and we were the St. John Ski Bees, my brothers and I, and my brother later on married one of the girls who was in the St. John Ski Bees. And if you go to Bartow, to George Washington Carver Park now, they have on display skis, and those were my brother's water skis. And during that episode,
Here right now.
oh, they, oh, in the exhibit room, all right. But that was sort of part of what was done during that period of time. And Bartow Carver Park hosted a tremendous number of celebrities. I remember Little Richard performing at Bartow Carver Park. I remember Ray Charles performing at Bartow Carver Park. I won't go back any further because it would reflect on my age. And more importantly, it might reflect on my wife's age, so I'm not going to go back any further than those 2 celebrities. But one of the celebrities who was at the park quite often was Dr. Martin Luther King, because their church had their annual picnic there. And during my first campaign, when I was running for the Court of Appeals after having been appointed, and no person of color had ever been elected in a statewide race, and so I got a call from Daddy King, Martin Luther King's dad, and he said he was very sick at the time. He said, I'd like for you to come down so I can give you my blessings. And then I didn't even know that he even knew me. And when I came down, he says, you're Clancy's boy. You the little kid was running around up at the beach all of the time. I said, well, I might have been. But he said he brought his church up there regularly. It was one of the few places they could go and thoroughly enjoy themselves. And so he remembered that the beach more than anything else. And I think because he remembered the beach, he was able to help me become elected when I ran for the first time in the state. But those things are the memorable things that happened. Now, there's a lot I can talk about the park. We just had a rededication recently with the name. The county has worked diligently to make sure that that came off all right. We have quite a few projects that we are going to do. In fact, I just mentioned the possibility that I'm an avid gardener, so I want to see us plant dogwoods and azaleas, and we're going to name the trails after some local people. Many of the people who were in the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts had their initiation up at the Bartow Carver Park. And there's a lot that we can talk about, and Mr. Atkinson is going to be here if you want to get some more details about it. But I want to make sure I cover all of these venues first. All right, now let's go to number 2. Now, this is the Masonic Building. It's up on Summer Hill, on the top of the hill, and that's the home for Mount Zion Lodge number 6, because that's my lodge, too. That's where I was initiated. That's where my daddy was initiated, and then the predecessor to Mount Zion Lodge number 6, my granddaddy was initiated. But that building represents the contributions of a lot of people who have been active in the Mount Zion Lodge, and I just sort of want to run down what that history was without getting into too much lodge talk. But the lodge initially was operated over here near where Easy Mills was, and it was a 3-story brick building, and it existed there until it was torn down and they built an Easy Mill, and after that, in the 50s, is when that building was built. But those buildings represented several different organizations. It was Mount Zion Lodge number 6. Mount Zion Lodge number 6 had been the successor to the Brotherhood Lodge. The Brotherhood Lodge was established after the Friendship Lodge. The Friendship Lodge was started by Ben Tompkins and Austin Benham, a distant relative of mine, who were one of the first people to get a corporation, a certificate charter from the state. And I do have the records of that charter and when it happened and how it happened and some of the members of that lodge when it was established. But that lodge also represents the many African-American lodges that existed. It was also the home of the Heroines of Jericho, who were established in 1922, the Eastern Star, which existed here, and also represented the Casper Lodge, which still is in existence, but they no longer have a building, the Adairsville Lodge, which is no longer in existence. In fact, we tried to save the Adairsville Lodge when I found out that that's what it was, and we were working on what we could do to establish that. But between the time we recognized that the Adairsville Lodge was still there, some vandals went in and burned the building down. So we lost that building. And that lodge also represents the Emerson Lodge. That Mr. George was the wishful master of the Emerson Lodge. And if you go up Gaston Westbrook Hill, there's a church on the left. When you go down in the valley, on the right, over there, was the Emerson Lodge, which was a 2-story building, and it was also the home of several doctors, the last doctor being Dr. Moore, who was also my family doctor too. And he has a history all of his own. So we have some of the records from some of those lodges, and I've cataloged some of that information. But this lodge here represents all of those lodges that existed. And don't let me forget my wife's lodge, the U. Harley Lodge. The U. Harley Lodge was not only the Masonic Lodge, it was my wife's elementary school from the 1st through the 4th grade. Stilesboro Lodge, I'm sorry, but it was her elementary school, and I remember that lodge very, very well. And it was in existence until the 1960s, probably the 1960s or so. But all of these landmarks were there, but some people just didn't even know what they were and what they meant to the community. And that's why we feel it's so important to recognize these buildings and preserve these buildings so that the whole county will have some sense of the significant history of the people who lived here. One more thing about the lodge that I think is important, because until recently, I had to pay 25 cents a month as a member of the Brotherhood Lodge. And I did that from the time I was a little child. And as my parents said, I had to belong to the Brotherhood Lodge. I just found out the significance of that, maybe a decade or two ago, and that is, as African Americans, you could not buy an insurance policy. The insurance companies would not insure you. And that's what gave rise to the African American insurance companies for whom my parents worked. My mother worked for the Afro-American insurance company. My dad worked for the North Carolina Mutual insurance company. There was also the Pilgrim Insurance Company. And all of these people would come to your house once a week and collect a dime, a nickel, or a quarter for your insurance policy, and that provided you a burial. One other interesting tidbit about the lodge: you couldn't just belong to a lodge. You had to have a skill to belong to a lodge, because the lodge also provided for the sick and the shut-in. If someone was sick, then the lodge members were expected to come and gather your crop, to cook your meals, to wash your clothes, and to repair your house. And that is the reason my dad forced me to learn how to lay bricks, because my dad had gone to the Summer Hill School, and he was a brick mason. And he says, if you're going to be a member of the lodge, you're going to have to do something with your hands. And to this very day, if you go up Aubrey Street, the street with the big hill, in the middle of that is the home of Miss Pauline Walford, who was my wife's aunt, and her husband. I laid the bricks on that basement when I was 12 years old. That's been over 50 years ago. And I take my children by there now. I say, you see those bricks? Your daddy laid those bricks. And you know what my kids do? Yeah, Daddy, we believe you. They don't, but the lodges required that you had some skill and some talent. You just could not be a member of the lodge, because lodge people, when you became sick, you went to the house, you gathered the crops, you cooked the meals, you fed the cattle, you cured the meat, you did whatever was required until they got on their feet again. If they died, then the lodge buried you. That's why 2 deacons in my church were coffin makers. And I didn't know that till later on. We were just talking. He said, oh yeah, I built coffins because I was a member of the lodge. And we built coffins for people who died. And we gave them 25 cents a week to get by on until they got back on their feet. But these are the roles that these organizations played over such a long period of time. And this is why they were so meaningful in the community. So now let's go to the next exhibit. Summer Hill School, is that the next one? Summer Hill School, and I forgot the picture. I have a picture of the old Summer Hill School in my office, and I keep it to remind me of the important role it played. The Summer Hill School that I attended was a Rosenwald school. It cost $2,600 to build, the Rosenwald Foundation would provide half of the money, and the local community had to provide the other half of the money. So people in the community, black, white, Oriental, and there was an Oriental laundry right downtown in Carver, right across from the First National Bank. But people contributed to that effort to make sure that education was provided for all of the students. And that school initially was first through the 8th grade. And I still keep in contact with at least one of my teachers who is 90. Did you see her the other day? She's 90, who lives in California. But those teachers would come here to teach the students here in Cartersville. And we have the listings, and Marion has the listing of probably all of the teachers in the various schools. Do you not, Marion? Or do you just have all of the teachers in the school system? And I won't talk about my disciplinary problems at school. My teacher, who is 90-something years old, I'm glad she didn't come because she would have brought them up still. So, but anyway, I started school when I was 4 years old, so I was expected to have some disciplinary problems. But the Summer Hill School had the reputation of being one of the best schools in Northwest Georgia, and we had dedicated teachers, dedicated principals. The principal we all remember is the one we call Fessa Morgan. In fact, we call him Fess when he wasn't around. But then he was succeeded by his son, John Morgan, the Morgan family, and then their son was principal of the Cartersville High School. So the Morgan family has been in the education business for a number of years, and Miss Laverta Morgan, who died within the last 2 years, was also my 12th grade teacher, and she taught in the predecessor to that school. And I'm sure we've got some pictures of the old.
Not in this, but we have some.
Right, but well, I have one in my office.
The website is full of
Okay.
them. I've got, if anybody, several of these have great websites, and I've got information up here. I apologize it's not on there.
And let me tell you what was important about those schools. Some of you might remember, but when you came to school that morning, you had to line up outside before going in. And then you would sing songs like America. The preacher, well, the principal, most of the times was a preacher anyway. But you also had to say a prayer, and then you had to march in files of 2 for school. And somebody was standing there at the door to make sure that if you had any chewing gum, bubble gum, or as some students had, tobacco, you had to give it out then and there because it was not allowed in the school in any way, shape, form, or fashion. That school was the successor to a school that existed on Carter Street, existed from the 1880s until 1928 when the Summer Hill School was succeeded by this particular school. But that school sat on the spot for the James Patton Funeral Home. Some of you might remember it because it was right down the road from the Blue Room, which was Joe Long's store where you could get 2 for a penny cookies. But that was the first location for the Summer Hill School on Carter Street. And when this new school was built in 1928, that school was torn down. Now let me move to the next exhibit. All right, now this is the slave cabin. This is probably the first time some of you have seen the slave cabin. This is Miss Viney's slave cabin, and very few people here knew the history of this cabin. Miss Viney was the cook for the family. I think the Choate family owns it now, but when I found out about it, The probate judge, Miss Norma Tidwell, who was a good friend of mine, called me and said, we want to find a way to preserve this home, and we wanted to tell you about the history. This was a slave cabin of Miss Viney, who was the cook for that family for a number of years. And that family has seen fit to preserve that cabin. Don Jones is here. He is with a group, and they are talking about the possibility of moving that slave cabin to the Noble Hill site. But in order for that to be done, it will probably have to be dismantled and taken to the site and reassembled. You have to admit, that building is well over 100 years old, but it is in roughly the same condition, same configuration that existed during that period of slavery. And we owe a deep debt of gratitude to the family for maintaining that building and then reaching out to members of this organization to tell us the history of that cabin and the need to preserve that. Because our young children need to see facilities such as this so that they can understand the history and appreciate the journey that it took to get from there to here. And Miss Viney, as she's called, was considered a member of the Choate family, is from what I understood, because they treasured her. She had been of service to the family over a number of years. Now, my children probably wouldn't understand this kind of relationship, but people had more things in common than they had things which separated them. And if they worked on the things they had in common, the things which separated them would become less and less significant. And that is the meaning of Miss Viney and her relationship with the family that she had known and they knew over a period of time. So I hope those of you who see this, the slave cabin, will not have negative views about that. But this needs to be here to show the relationships people have and the need to preserve these kinds of buildings because they do tell a story in terms of where we were and how relationships were and how people were treasured no matter what role they played during a certain a period of time. It was the family that actually owned my family that reached out to me and gave me a list of all of the Benham slaves. And we now talk routinely about it because a little information will come out here and a little information will come out there. And when you know your history, it gives you a better sense of yourself and the things that happen in relationships that people have. All right, let's go to the next exhibit. All right, this is the Black Pioneer Cemetery. It says circa 1830s. In order to appreciate this, you have to appreciate how the church existed during that particular period of time. This is known as the Native American and African American Cemetery. And I think you probably passed by it numerous times and not known it was there, but they have little stakes in the ground. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 bodies existed, and they were either Native Americans or African Americans. And I want to thank the Nelson family in the U-Harley community and the many families who brought this type of information to the attention, because I passed by there numerous times, never knew it was cemetery, but it was between the two churches there in the U-Harley community. And of course, there are other cemeteries there, but the African Americans and Native Americans were buried in this particular cemetery. Now, we don't have any tombstones at all, and we have very few records, but the churches there do have some records, and some of these people might have, they also attended churches in the churches in U-Harley, and they sat in the balconies of those churches in New Orleans. So hopefully as we look at deeper into some of the records, we can find more meaningful information about those churches. But it was just only recently that information came forward. I think Ms. Nelson was very instrumental in helping with some of that information, and several other people in the community. And it shows the allegiance between not only African American community and the white community, but also the Native American community. Some people thought all of the Native Americans left in the Trail of Tears, where they all didn't leave. Some of them were still in the area, and some of them actually were buried out in that particular cemetery. I'm going to reach out to one of my law clerks who is Native American, and maybe I can put her on the trail, and she can help run down some of the leads. But she is a Lami Yakahaw Indian from Washington, D.C., so I don't know whether she knows much, but she attends the powwows here in Georgia, and so she might have some contacts that I can exploit to get that information from her. Now let's go to the next exhibit. Like I said, there are between 200 and 300 graves out there at the Pioneer Cemetery. Okay, this is the covered bridge. All of you probably have seen the covered bridge by now, but my wife reminded me that until recent years, she had no idea about the history, because as a young child, they drove across that bridge twice a day, going back and forth to school in Stylesboro, but had no idea that that bridge had been constructed by an African American. W.W. King and his sons had been slaves in Alabama. All of the covered bridges you see in the Southeast were constructed by that one family. They gained their freedom from the bridge building. And we have here in Georgia, I think probably as many as 10 of those bridges here in Georgia. Many of them, 16 bridges, 16, okay. Here in Georgia, all of those bridges were built by the same family. One interesting thing about the King family, the son who did some of the bridges was an engineer, received an engineering degree from Oberlin College. You know, he was just not out there knocking nails and cutting planks. This guy was an engineer, and he helped construct a lot of the bridges. But they had developed it to such an art that the father won his freedom from slavery by bridge building. And I think that is one of the bridges that is built completely of wood. There is not an iron peg in there anywhere. Now, you tell me somebody who can build a bridge like that stood for almost 150 years or so. But everything has pegs in it in terms of how that bridge was constructed. So you wonder, how did they get the bridge from Alabama to Cartersville? Well, they weren't using trains to do it then. It is my understanding that what they did is they loaded that bridge on barge in pieces and floated it up the various rivers, including the Etowah River, to get it to the location there at U-Harley. And then when they got it to the location in U-Harley, took it off in wagons and reconstructed it there, and it's been there for 100 or so plus years. You're talking about engineering marvel. When you take your young daughters and sons, you'll be proud of me, Nell, for saying daughters and sons and not just sons. See, I'm coming along. When you take your daughters and sons to see that, to see what was done over 100 years ago, and former slaves were accomplished in terms of building facilities such as that. The story goes on because that facility had been there for a number of years, and some years back, it was my pleasure to serve on the board of directors of the Georgia Historical Society. So you know what I said, we got to designate the bridge in my hometown for that. So we came, and I think they had a television coverage of it, and we placed the plaque that you will see maybe at the other end of it from the Georgia Historical Society, designated it as a historical marker as so. Okay, and that's the bridge. How am I on time? Am I running? Okay, now the next is it. Now that is the church in Cassville, which was one of the few, if not the only church remaining in Cassville after Sherman took his march through the sea and came through what was then Cass County. He burned the courthouse, he burned most of the buildings in town, and that was one of the few buildings left standing in town, that particular church. And at that time, the church was used for a hospital during the Civil War, and it maintained its integrity over the period of time. And the church decided, it was a decision made later on to give the church to some of the local congregations here in Bartow County, and I think 3 different churches or 3 different ministers have pastored at that church. The church has fallen into disrepair, and I think Sherry has been working with several groups trying to maintain its integrity so it won't be torn down. So if she calls on any of you to help with that particular project, I hope you will give a lending ear and a helping hand to that project. That was is it the Presbyterian Church?
It was formerly a Presbyterian.
It was a Presbyterian church, and they gave that church to the African American community as its home, and that church has been in existence since before the Civil War. But its integrity has been compromised significantly over the years, and it will take a valiant effort to restore it and maintain it. But I think it's critically important to maintain that because that shows positive connections between the races in terms of people working together, preserve things together, because there are some people who believe that in the South, blacks and whites were at each other's throat all the time. That just was not the case. And some people would like to perpetuate that image. People were constantly reaching across racial lines, economic lines, lending a helping hand. And when we have facilities such as this church, it's proof positive that that kind of thing was going on over 100 years ago, and it continues to this very day. So I hope you will lend your support and your efforts to that particular matter. Now let's move to the next. Now this is Noble Hill School, the one that's in Cassville. And I want to spend a little time talking about Noble Hill because we have Marion here, who is the curator of the museum. We have Johnny May, who helped in the museum. We have several members of the Hurds family who helped in the museum. Anybody else? Joy is not here, is she?
She's got choir practice.
Oh, she's a choir practicer. Who? Dawn, who is my classmate from high school, has worked valiantly at the museum. A Fort Valley graduate, HBCU man, and he has worked. And in fact, I was up there just this past week, brought my grandkids who were visiting from West Palm Beach up here to see the Noble Hill School. We were in there no more than 10 minutes, and Dawn Jones shows up from Atlanta. Does he have a cot somewhere in the back room back there, man? Seems like every time I'm up there, he's up there. And but his family has worked valiantly, Dawn Jones, with that facility. His sister-in-law worked and contributed mightily to that museum. Let me tell you how it started at Noble Hill. It was a Rosenwald school in the 1920s, and the way those facilities were built was that the Rosenwald family who actually ran Sears and Roebuck, actually made contributions. But it required some sweat equity in the local community. There was some 1,500 of those schools built throughout the South, not just the Southeast, but throughout the South. I know they existed as far away as Texas. But what happened is that Rosenwalds would supply one half of the money, which would be about $1,500, and the local communities would supply the other half of that money, which we call the sweat equity, and making that work. I talked to several students who went to that school. My mama went to that school. My granddaddy, I understand, taught briefly at that school, but you know what pay was for teachers back then, so he gave up teaching to work in the mines. went up around Fairmount, but he taught at that school, and my mama attended that school, and many of the people you see in this community attended that school. But you couldn't attend free. You had to pay a fee to attend school, and I think I reminded Marion as we were talking about the history of that school, somebody raised the question as to why the school was raised up on bricks the way it was, that would let air in. It would be more difficult to heat. And I explained to them why it was raised up like that. If you could not afford to pay the $1 a year, I believe that's what it was, might have been 15 cents a quarter. So if you could not afford to pay that, then you had to bring a cord of wood to school. And the cord of wood would be stored under the front of that building, and where you see the bricks now. That would be where you stored your cord of wood, and that would be your tuition for the year. And that's why the schools were raised as they were, so that the wood would be kept dry and students could contribute their wood so that they knew that they had some sweat equity in that particular building. Another interesting fact about when that building was restored, I'm very proud of how the idea came about. My oldest son is 43 now, and I had to take him to see the Rosenwald School. They didn't know why I took him to see that school. That school had caved in 20 plus years ago, and it was covered in bushes and debris. And my oldest son and I were riding up the highway, and we stopped for some reason, and he said, "Daddy, what's that pile of junk up in the woods?" And I looked up there and I knew, I said, "I think that's where your granddaddy taught school." It was all grown up and everything. We walked up through the woods. I went over next door to Miss Bertha and asked her what that was. And the chimney was still standing, but the roof was caved in. And she said, "Oh, that's old Noble Hill School." That was the school. My youngest son, who now is my oldest son, who's 8 years old, turned around and he said, "Daddy, why don't they make a museum out of it?" That was the first time anybody had ever mentioned a museum. How he thought that was important, I don't know, but I give him credit for planting the seed. Then we talked to Miss Bertha. Miss Bertha then got in touch with Dr. Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler got in contact with people all over the state. We started raising money, and it began. But it was a community effort. And evidence of the community effort, and Marion, you might remember this, but as we were reconstructing that building, most of the contractors in town, most of whom were white, started coming by on Fridays, and they said, "We usually knock off on Friday, but we pay our workers until 5 o'clock. we're going to let them work at Noble Hill. That's a community coming together, working together on a project. And that's how a lot of that work was done when contractors came by and left their employees to work the remaining 4 hours at Noble Hill. And they paid them just as if they were working on a skyscraper or building in town while they were working on Noble Hill. And that helped restore it to the place it is. There were some contractors who were working who had extra material, came by and says, if you need this, you're welcome to it. There's some who had bulldozers, says, if you need the parking lot scraped, if you need the road scraped, my bulldozer operator can scrape it. This is what a community is about. This is how we reach out to each other. This is how we support each other and how we help each other. Now, I could talk for the rest of the hour about Noble Hill, but I wanted you to understand at least that part of the history of Noble Hill. It's a museum now. I want to thank First Commissioner Brown and now our present commissioner. They've worked and they've supported, paid the salaries for the people who have worked at that museum over a period of time. And that shows the commitment that we have in this community to salvaging that building and having it being a showcase for it. So you're welcome to come to participate in any of the activities we have there over any period of time. All right, now I'm getting close to the end now. Miss Melvina Shields is the great-great-granddaughter of Michelle Obama. And I want to thank Ms. Applin, who worked tirelessly on that project during the research, discovering that Miss Melvina was a midwife in Kingston, delivered some of the families, babies in Kingston, and she and her family lived in Kingston for a number of years, and now her burial place is there in Kingston, and it's being listed in a lot of national magazines. And that's that picture of that. Now when somebody stops me and they're coming through Cartersville at one of the restaurants and they're looking for somewhere to go, they says, well, we understand President Obama's wife's great-grandmother is buried somewhere around here. And I'm glad to tell them that it's in Kingston behind, is it Queen's Chapel? Near Queen's Chapel. Yeah, Queen's Chapel. I was there for the dedication, and it just shows the connections that we have here in Bartow County over a number of years. I think I got, how many, 2 more to go or just one?
Yeah, one more.
One more to go. Butler Shusto, and I want to take a little time on this because I stumble up on Butler Shusto. My mama used to be a beautician, and she would go to Adairsville to fix Miss Emma Dozer's hair. And Miss Emma Dozer is the daughter of Mr. Butler. And I like to talk to people who are over 90 years of age. That's one of my projects, you know. If I come to see you to talk about it, you better realize you're getting up in age, you know. But one of my projects is talking to people who are over 90 years of age. I think Miss Emma was only 85. And I went to talk to Miss Emma sitting out on the porch about Native Americans because I heard that she knew where the caves were and knew about the hieroglyphics on the caves and things like that. And we just talked about the caves that existed in and around Adairsville, some 6 caves, some of whom still have the hieroglyphics and the images from the Native American life here in some of those caves, and Miss Emma knew where all of those caves were, and she also knew that this was part of the escape route for slaves running from slavery. They found their way to the North Georgia mountains and followed the trails with the help of the Native Americans toward their freedom. So I wanted to see some of those caves and everything. And Miss Emma Dozer was telling me about that. And she said, you know anything about my daddy's store downtown? And I said, well, I didn't know any African Americans had stores in downtown Emerson. And then she told me the story about her dad having the store, I think in the 30s, 40s or so, for a period of time in Adairsville. And that's the picture of the store that you see right there in downtown Adairsville that existed almost 100 years ago. And some people think, well, nobody had any stores, any people of color. Well, there were 3 African-American businesses and the other one I learned from the cemetery. And Mr. Posey was one of the most prosperous African-Americans in Adairsville because he was a blacksmith. And he did a lot of the blacksmith work, and we're still uncovering information on him. But the reason he came to my attention is I wanted to know what this real statue was doing in the African-American cemetery. It must represent somebody. And that was Mr. Posey. He was a blacksmith in downtown Adairsville. And the Butler Shusto was there for a number of years. And Ahmad, would you stand up, Ahmad, so they can see you? He is working on the project with the Butler Shusto. That was would have been what, your relatives?
Great-great-grandfather.
Great-great-grandfather, Mr. Butler, was the one who ran that store. That building is now owned by the Choate family. And is it the Choate family?
Dr.
No,
Sherry.
Roland.
The Rowland family, I'm sorry, the Choate family is with the other house. But I think they're working with him and seeing if they can't.
We're discussing that.
They're in a negotiation stage at this point. But it reflects the cooperation that we see here in Bartow County and these projects and everything. And Miss Mendoza was very helpful for me because she and I had several conversations over the years, and she gave a lot of information on Adairsville, the other stores that existed in Adairsville, the theater, the African-American theater in Adairsville. I said, you got to be kidding me. No, they had a theater in a grocery store that was run by Mr. Ingram. And Mr. Ingram was blind at the time. And so it was that kind of cooperation that existed throughout that period of time. Well, I think I've covered all of the spots. I thank you for your attention and everything, and thank you for coming. Well, thank you for the hospitality and the cordiality.
Thank you, Robert, for being here this evening and for your great information. Thank you, Sherry.